So this session is a discussion of what Canadian leadership in global health actually means and how to achieve what we aspire to do. Reflecting on the past couple of days, we're going to be in discussion with Julie Delahanty, Caroline Leclerc, and John Mcarthur. They will offer their views on what are the tangible next steps that Canada needs to take. Our panelists here are going to offer bold suggestions for concrete action that can be taken beyond 2020. So I will introduce our three panelists. If you can please come and join me on the stage. I will start with Caroline Leclerc, that you've heard yesterday. She's Assistant Deputy Minister, Partnerships for Development Innovation. She joined the federal government in 1995 and occupied several positions of increasing level and complexity before joining CEDA. She's been overseeing the implementation of the government's commitment to support developing countries' efforts to adapt to and mitigate the causes of climate change and representing the government internationally in a number of multilateral organizations. Julie Delahanty, Executive Director at Oxfam Canada, is a leader on gender equality and human rights with more than 20 years of international development experience. Before joining Oxfam, she was the Director of the Central America Program for Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs and has served as the Director of CEDA's Gender Equality and Child Protection Division. She chairs the Gender Justice Committee and is a member of the Safeguarding Task Force for Oxfam. John Mcarthur is a Senior Fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution. He is also a Senior Advisor to the UN Foundation and a Board Governor for the International Development Research Center. He also co-founded the Global Network of Masters in Development practice programs that has since been launched across 5 continents. So warm welcome to our panelists. Now we will begin with the first remarks from Caroline. Would you like to do them at the
non,
here?
Ça va, je vais assis.
Rester assise,
Oui,
parfait.
si c'est possible, je vais rester assis.
So I'm going to try to sit and not to talk from the podium. Thank you for that introduction. Good morning, or good afternoon, rather, to everyone. Happy to see you.
Commitment to the issue that you're still here with a wine fair next door. And if I see people sneaking out, I know where you're going. And I'll see you in an hour. J'étais ici hier matin.
I was here yesterday morning, and when I was trying to consider what I will be saying today, I realized that at one point I was talking about the same thing that we addressed, and I thought that for 2 reasons. Yesterday, we were looking at Canada's leadership from 2010 to 2017, 2018, and today I thought I wanted to examine Canada's leadership starting from now to 2020 to 2030, and I realized that there's a commonality. There's a starting point and there's an end point, and that all these 2 points are here, and we have to talk about them. So we really have to understand where we are and what we have to do. Moreover, I think it's also very difficult to project ourselves into the future. We don't know what lies in the future, what's going to happen in 2030. We all think that, we all have different interpretations. Today, we're perhaps older, we have more gray hair, we perhaps have more money, but it's difficult to really understand what the future has for us.
So what we have today, we have the SDGs and we have a feminist international assistance policy that really tells us to position women and girls at the center of all of our interventions. And that is quite ambitious. It is ambitious to set ourselves up to transform power relations, social norms and attitudes that really keep women and girls behind. That's a really tall order. It also requires us to think that It can't be business as usual. We have to think and we have to act differently. And also, we need to address gaps. And so those are the things I talked about yesterday. In particular, the gaps in maternal and newborn child health, adolescent girls, but sexual and reproductive health and rights. We're so used to saying SRHR, sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we also have funding commitments. We had Budget 2018, which committed $2 billion to implement the Feminist International Assistance Policy and $1.5 billion for innovative financing. We also, in the policy, committed $650 million to address the gaps in SRHR. We also have funding to broaden our partnership in the form of the Small and Medium Organization Initiative. We have funding for women voice and leadership. So we do have a lot today, and I think we have to be steadfast and think about implementing. What does that say for our vision of the future? In my mind, the policy sets up a vision of the future where all people are enabled to equally exercise their rights, access opportunities, and experience safety and security. That, in my mind, is the vision. So over the past 2 days, you've discussed how we can shift our programming to meet this vision. From what I heard, in terms of living up to the SDGs and living up to the Feminist International Assistance Policy, we really do need to truly understand and acknowledge what it means that it's an integrated agenda. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire quand on dit que les...
What does it mean when SDGs are inalienable? That means what? That means, well, we don't want to do some cherry picking. That's not the objective. We really have to have integrated and complete objectives and approaches. Health approach has to take into consideration women's rights and education. So that's one of the first lessons drawn. And as far as I'm concerned, what this means for me,
a no-vertical approach that will position to achieve our objectives. We really do need to start from the intersection point. And the intersection point is a woman, a girl, an adolescent, that's within a family, a community, and a country. That's where it starts. Second is the conversation that I'm sorry I missed, but I sort of tried to follow on social media, is about equitable partnerships. I think that we've heard that this vibrant partnership here, it needs to grow and it needs to evolve a bit. I think we need to deepen our roots in developing countries, with governments, with communities, and also with new partners, because that's what's going to enable us to connect our sector with other solutions, other types of partnership, and be more nimble and adaptable to be able to put in place these integrated or comprehensive solutions that we're talking about. And my third point is about data. We've talked a lot about data. And don't throw tomatoes at me, but I actually think that what we need is knowledge. It's knowledge creation, it's knowledge exchange, and it's knowledge absorption. I find that when we talk about research with people, they go, meh, research, time-consuming, expensive. But if you say data and metrics, it actually sounds sort of cool. You're trendy when you talk about data and metrics. But I think we sort of have to get beyond that a bit and talk about gathering knowledge and creating systems and platforms that enables the knowledge to be more useful than just within our own projects, but also to our collective effort. So it's more than yesterday I had this analogy about the star, but I do think that when you create knowledge, you have to think about the constellation in the universe, not only to be able to show how successful you've been, to actually help you be successful. The last piece I want to talk about is the type of leadership that I think we need to enable this. I think what got us to here, and that's what I talked about yesterday, is a leadership that was about influence and tools and achieving results. So going forward, in my mind, if we're going to live up to our ambition, we're going to have the courage to tackle some pretty difficult and sensitive issues like abortion and like gender-based violence. And for that, we will need to lead with conviction. Because it's a fast-paced world, and there are moving parts to all these things that we're discussing. We will need responsive and intelligent leadership. We'll need the leadership that has the willingness and the ability to learn and to shift. We're going to have to be able to say, yeah, here, it didn't work. We were wrong. We're moving in this direction now. And lastly, because the issues we want to talk about, we're talking about power relations and attitudes and beliefs. That goes to the core of people. And to be able to work in this environment, you actually need to be sensitive. You need very thoughtful leadership. And I'm going to end on that.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Caroline, d'avoir partagé.
Thank you, Caroline, for having shared with us your vision of the future and integrated approach. That's really interesting. And what you said was quite interesting, the emphasis on knowledge sharing. That could supplement the metrics and the different data that we have. That's very interesting and very important. Thank you very much.
For her remarks, please.
Thanks so much. And am I on? Yeah. And thanks to Caroline. Those were really great comments. It's really wonderful to see the kind of vision and the momentum and the reflective thought that's happened at this conference today. And I want to compliment and congratulate CanWatch as well on their leadership on global health in this meeting and trying to get feminist principles into our Canadian global health interventions to make sure that those interventions are really, truly transformative. So congratulations to you on the conference. There's many things that Canadian leadership in global health could mean. Caroline's talked about some of them. I know John will talk more, particularly when we're looking at building a gender transformative approach that looks at the root causes of issues and the kind of blocks to women realizing their rights. And you've talked about a lot of those things in the last 2 days at this conference, whether it's the indivisibility or the universality of the SDGs, looking at inequality and its importance around feminist approaches to data, around some issues around power. But I want to highlight, or at least start by highlighting a very particular area where I think that Canada can show great leadership and has taken leadership in the area. And that's one of the most globally contentious health issues, which is sexual and reproductive health and rights. We know that global progress has been unequal and inconsistent on SRHR, with hundreds of millions of women who want to avoid pregnancy, who aren't able to have access to contraception, with 22 million women having unsafe abortions, with pregnancy and its consequences being the leading cause of mortality for 15 to 19-year-old adolescent girls in many developing countries. And comprehensive sexuality education is also missing, which obviously can lead to things like STIs or HIV or, of course, unwanted pregnancies. But also, that education can provide the tools that can challenge harmful norms and attitudes about things like relationships, consent, masculinity, gender, all of those things. So sexual and reproductive health and rights is an area where we can surface some deeper issues around sexism and gender inequality, but it's often ignored, or it's set aside, or it's removed from government policy or government action, or from organizational action and policy. And there have been, of course, a lot of strides that have been made, but the battle continues in many areas, whether that's ensuring equal access to information and education, whether it's improving access to safe, confidential abortion or post-abortion care, or whether it's reducing the stigma and negative social norms that perpetuate gender inequalities and that compromise women's ability to have control over their own bodies. The Canadian global health community's commitment to feminism has a role to play in that battle. The Canadian government's already demonstrated very strong leadership on sexual and reproductive health and rights, including through the Feminist International Assistance Policy, which puts SRHR as a key priority, and of course, what Carolyn already mentioned, the $650 million that the government has put forward for the full range of sexual and reproductive health and services and information. The Government of Canada could solidify further its position as a global leader on SRHR by continuing to invest, and particularly by investing and using a predictable long-term timetable for that investment, and especially in some of the most neglected areas of SRHR and its agenda, namely around contraception, access to safe abortion, adolescent sexual and reproductive health and rights that I know many of you have spoken about, and importantly, advocacy for sexual and reproductive health and rights. And it also includes sexual and reproductive health and rights in fragile and humanitarian contexts, and it would be great to see earmarked, dedicated funding from the humanitarian budget to this issue. Canada, of course, can also continue to be a leader in the policy forums, whether that's in Geneva and New York, or around the G7, or the Women Deliver conference, et cetera. Another area that I think global affairs in particular can lead is by developing a robust sexual and reproductive health and rights policy to guide programming, including in humanitarian settings, with transparency and accountability mechanisms. Given the global context, it would be great to see that policy covering some of the most neglected areas of SRHR. And importantly, SRHR policy and programming should be demand-driven, and that really means that it has to be asking women what it is they want, as opposed to just offering them whatever it is we think that they want. And often in communities, you have women who they may have access to a modern method of contraception, but it's only one, and you've been talking here about a life cycle approach, and that includes throughout a woman's life, she may need different kinds of contraceptives available to her, and women will drop off of using contraception because it's not the right contraceptive for them. So that whole issue of demand side is incredibly important and often extremely ignored. And finally, I think we can all work to support a feminist transformation in Canada by increasing our work and resources in both the government, but also within our own organizations that are dedicated to women's rights and to sexual and reproductive health and rights. We can also support women's rights organizations and feminist movements, including in their advocacy efforts. We have to talk a lot more, as Carolyn said, about power and what that means, power out there, power in our programs, power within our own organizations. Building robust evidence base in our program that not only fills the gaps in gender data, which are obviously missing, but that are also feminist in nature. So they're intersectional, they're inclusive, they're building on agency and capacity of women's organizations and women. And finally, by advancing feminist research, evaluation, and learning in all of our programs. I'm done pretty much. So yeah, it's just we need that kind of broad commitment from the Government of Canada and from all of our organizations on these issues.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Julie, for highlighting the Canadian leadership in SRHR, the importance of increasing and sustaining political and financial leadership beyond 2020. And I love that point about actually listening to the demand and to the needs that's been brought up in other panels as well. What do they actually need so that we can provide the tools? John?
Great. Merci, Caroline.
Thank you, Caroline and Julie. First of all, I'd like to congratulate you all. I just arrived this afternoon, but I was following you through Twitter today and yesterday. I can see that you are the best, you're the cream of the cream. And that's a good way of moving forward.
Sincerely, you're the best of the best. And it's really important to understand just how far this community has come in the past 8 years since 2010, but really in the past 20 years since 1998, which was really the low point in global health, 1996 to 98, in terms of international efforts. And it was 1996 when the AIDS conference was in Vancouver, and we just discovered antiretrovirals. It's been an extraordinary shift that you all have been leading. I say that because in my experience, I'm an economist, I am a dilettante, I have the privilege of working with many communities, specialist communities, and I see time and again the leaders in health, global health, public health, and so forth, are so deep in their debates that they don't realize how lucky they are compared to the debates others get to have. And it's not to say the debates aren't important, but it's to say that we need to understand how much you have to teach others too. So what do I mean by that? Well, I'd like to add a question, if I may, just to ask each of you to take a moment. If you were to give Canada a score from 0 to 10, and think in your own mind, how successful is the society as a society? The biggest, vaguest, but most important question. What number would you give it? If 0 is the worst and 10 is just the greatest, it's all perfect, and 5 is somewhere in between. If anyone has the audacity to share, would anyone be able to show with their fingers what they came up with? 8?
7.
Anyone 5 or below? 6? So I wonder what the answer would be to that question if I went to an Indigenous community in this country. I wonder what it would be if I went to the downtown east side of my hometown of Vancouver. I wonder what it would be if I was in Calgary today, which is on the tail end of a very difficult economic situation. There are so many answers to that question, there is no single answer. If I were to ask as myself, how are we doing on global issues? Are we perfect? Have we solved this? Probably not. We've made great progress, we've done many great things, but the deepest question, and this is something Margaret Biggs and I have been working on lately, is it's not how we're doing today, it's where are we going? What's our trajectory? So if I were to tell you that there's a country that's moving backwards in the wrong direction on child obesity, food insecurity, access to drinking water, violence against children, and substance abuse, you'd probably think that country's not doing great. That's true for Canada, each of those things I just said. But there's so many other things where we're doing extremely well. And if we think about, well, there's a country that's standing by where on current trajectory globally, more than 10 million children will die if the world doesn't follow through on its commitments. More than 1.6 million mothers will die if the world doesn't figure out how to do better than it's doing today. We would say, that's not success. That's more than 11 million people dying. But that's the difference between business as usual and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's not to say that things aren't getting better, but it means that business as usual, even when it's getting better, might not be good enough. And I say this because I think the Sustainable Development Goals are a way to translate that instinct of the need to do better in our communities and in the world into measurable outcomes across economic, social, and environmental issues. And so I think we need to resist a dynamic that's been popping up a lot, which is to say which goal is most important. We have to pick one, we have to pick priorities. Well, Frankly, there's 30 members in the federal cabinet these days. I think they can each handle at least one goal. In fact, they already have more than one each. So let's not say one cabinet member is more important than another. But more importantly, is one person's food insecurity more important than another person's domestic violence? It's a silly way to think about what we're trying to do. So I think we need to build on the success that this community's had, to think not just how the global bit can improve, how the domestic bit can improve, because what we've seen in the politics of the world, I would argue, is that if our communities don't work, the world doesn't work. And if the world doesn't work, our communities won't work. And that's the universal agenda. So I have some thoughts I can come back to on maybe some specifics for how we can put that into motion, but I just want to, again, celebrate you, congratulate you, but now I want to work with you and think with you, or learn from you, how do we triple it? Because that's our challenge for 2030.
Well, thank you, John, for those very thought-provoking remarks, and I echo your comments about CanWatch and the team. That absolutely phenomenal. Now for the panel discussion part. My first question goes to you, Caroline. When it comes to engaging non-traditional partners and addressing gap areas in women's and children's health, are there other ways in which you foresee fundamental changes?
Merci. Let me share just a little story with you. When my team told me I was on a panel with John Mcarthur, I almost fainted. Do you know how intimidating that is?
How do you think I felt?
Yeah. But then when he started explaining that 0 is the low point, and 10 is the high point, and 5 is in the middle, I'm like, oh, okay, I get it. I can follow. I know what he's talking about, right? So it's okay. I'm doing fine. Not to worry. Might need more wine after. That is actually very good and very inspiring. Yeah. Lots of food for thought. So now my brain's empty. But in terms of what other ways that we think the policy brings in fundamental changes, there are other pieces of the Feminist International policy that are very meaningful and are going to push us forward as a department, also as a collective. The policy commits that 95% of all our new initiatives will integrate gender equality. 15% of this will actually be gender transformative initiative. Now that's a real challenge, and that's quite significant. And what that will mean is that there will be new resources available for the empowerment of women and girls. And there's also a real commitment to innovation. And we have to challenge ourselves to think of innovation as something that's more than technologies. It's about new policies, new programming, and new partnerships. And the third piece that I'd like to flag in terms of what actually could be transformational, it actually sounds pretty mundane, is the real need for systems that enable us to learn. And I probably sound like a broken record. I keep coming back to sort of the same points, but I really do think that if you repeat them often enough, they start to make sense to you, and then you can start to operationalize them.
Ça fait bien du sens.
Yeah.
Oui.
That makes a lot of sense. My next question is for Julie.
Government can do. In your opinion, how do you think CSOs can contribute to the agenda?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And I think, I think that there's a lot more that we as organizations can do to support this agenda. Oxfam Canada has been on a journey for about 12 years, becoming a feminist organization, calling ourselves a feminist organization, and then actually trying to walk that talk of what a feminist organization is. And every organization may not feel that they're ready for that, but I think every organization can commit to feminist principles, even if they don't want to call themselves a feminist organization. And those principles involve things like considering agency and intersectionality and power, thinking about power in your own organizations. And there's a lot of specific things that you can do. You can hire feminists is one of the things that we always joke about, that a couple of feminists would be good in any organization. But changing the way we do research, developing the way we work in partnership with other organizations is also really important. So when we're working in partnership, it means you really have to think through how you're governing your programs. Are women that you're working with just beneficiaries, or are they part of your program, and how are you integrating them into your program in a way that's actually real and where they actually have real decision-making power within your programs? That's actually quite a difficult thing to do in many cases, but it's a really important conversation to have. And I think also looking within your own organizations at what I would call bottleneck issues around women's rights and gender equality, and really trying to tackle those, whether that's sexual and reproductive health and rights, if you're a health organization, or violence against women, women's economic empowerment, the way you're doing the way you're doing your evaluations, are you taking a feminist approach to the way you're evaluating? Are you bringing women on board and having them participate in those evaluations? All of those things, I think, as organizations, are things that we have to do to in a way, it's pretty crazy that it's the government that's given us this challenge, and I think it's a great opportunity for all of us to rise to the challenge and build on our own principles that will lead to results for development as well.
Thank you, Julie. John, you mentioned local challenge that we have here in Canada. How do you connect those to global challenges?
I think one of the most important things that's given me inspiration lately is the Community Foundations of Canada taking on the SDGs as their focus for connecting the local with the national with the global. They've coordinated, there's a whole North American Summit of Community Foundations in Mexico in February that really has been working this through. And just in my own conversations with foundations in Vancouver and Winnipeg and the national office, I'm just learning about this in a sense. I feel embarrassed how little I knew of how important their role is, because they've been linking this with the so-called Vital Voices campaign, many of you might notice, community survey, but what we don't have yet is outcome metrics that are common across communities. So how can each community measure its progress out to 2030? One of the things that's so important, and again, this coalition is so emblematic of, is the fact that this was an agenda that was initiated, in a sense, under a Liberal government. Really, Prime Minister Harper provided so much crucial leadership. Now a new Liberal government is providing so much leadership. This is beyond politics. Similarly, the Prime Minister Harper government signed on to the SDGs. Now the Trudeau government is leading. This is all beyond politics. Well, the same thing applies in our cities, our municipalities, our provinces. And what we need, I would argue, is a common set of outcome metrics so that people in Kenora can compare themselves to the people in Kamloops and get a sense of, here's how we're doing on the things we care about. Here's how our society is measuring success. But, how come they're doing better than us on the same metrics? Crucially, we need it at the provincial level too. And this is, I think, the biggest piece missing so far in Canada, because the provincial jurisdictions are so crucial. And they support our universities, which are in many ways our gateways to the world. We need to develop, I would argue, a national conversation on outcome metrics, so that the debate isn't where are we trying to go, the debate is competing visions for how to get there. And I think that there's a real room and hunger I'm seeing, that's why it's exciting, a hunger to do it, but we need to crystallize it just like you have in this community.
Thank you. Caroline, you mentioned addressing the gaps in SRHR as a key to providing comprehensive care. Would you care to elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, thank you. Now, Julie spoke a lot about that, and that was quite complete, and it's hard to disagree with anything she said. Something that I think we have to watch for is that we're talking about comprehensive care and addressing gaps in SRHR, and we have a real focus on these gaps at the moment, and we have to be very careful that we don't create silos between SRHR and health systems and MNCH more broadly. So we always have to keep an eye for that sort of dynamic system that we're working within. The next thing that I'd like to mention is we will need to, and Julie alluded to that, we will need to have, to do smart advocacy on some really tough issues like abortion. And in the call that we launched recently for Project in Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights, we've asked our partners to put emphasis on advocacy activities to help advance that conversation. So we very much look forward to seeing the type of solutions that our partners will offer. We will also need to sort of keep connected to see who's best placed to act where, on what sort of sub-element of this very sort of complicated picture that we're painting, and who's in the best position to lead at what time.
Great. So Julie, indeed you focused on this important topic of SRHR, and the key pre-conference document focused on the question, what changes do we need to adopt gender transformative approaches? In your opinion, what changes do you think are needed for our work to be truly transformative?
I think we can't only focus on the what, but we also have to focus on the how when it comes to those kinds of changes. So the what, of course, is thinking about how we're dismantling the kinds of systems and power structures that lead to health inequities. And that also includes really thinking about attitudes, norms, and behaviors, and how those things are all working together. And then also looking at areas that intersect with those kinds of health issues like women's economic empowerment or gender and emergencies and sexual and reproductive health as well. But then I think it's also thinking a lot about how we're doing those things, and the how for me are things like working as partners, whether that's collaborating here in this room with our colleagues to sort of push ourselves to be bolder and braver on some of the issues that we're working on, whether it's how we're working with women's rights organizations around the world and really putting them in the driver's seat around the kind of programming that we're doing, and also working together around building collective knowledge and really thinking a lot differently, I think, about our monitoring, evaluation, and learning approach. Because it really can't, this kind of thing can't just be an extractive process, which is often the way that it's being done right now. And I think that's a conversation for all of us, both at Global Affairs and the government, but also within our own organizations, that we really need to allow the organizations that we're working with to have a really strong say in what they think is their own evaluation, their own building that kind of learning amongst each other. And I also think we have to be we have to understand our own privilege when we're doing any of this. So sort of placing ourselves, knowing our place, knowing our power, knowing our privilege.
Great. Well, thank you, Julie. Well, last question for John before we open up the floor, very briefly, because we're actually already running. This is not the right time. This started 5 minutes late. So John, what are the next steps? What can we do for this year to be the most impactful ever?
Well, keep running is first point. But second, and I'm going to play the economist card right now, forgive me. Caroline, you might want to plug your ears for this part. But no, in all sincerity, I had the privilege very early in my career to be involved with something called the World Health Organization's Commission on Macroeconomics and Health. And I saw how, and many of you might have been involved as well, and I saw how that changed the conversation around the role of resources. I would argue right now, especially in this country, we're in desperate need of a new conversation around resources and a new business case for resources. Politically right now, we're in a bit of a worst case scenario where the government, not the political part, not the civil servants, make a commitment. I have to say very frankly, the commitment was basically agreeing to take what was an eroding base and flatten it out. It was kind of an inflation adjustment with a little boost. And that was a huge victory to get that. Just to be very clear, that was a huge amount of effort to get that. Everyone deserves tremendous credit, but then a lot of people say, well, why aren't you doing more? We have to do all these other things. France has said they're doing more, UK's doing more. Why aren't we doing our bit more? And then everyone said, well, we just gave you money, why are you complaining? And it's a very difficult situation that I think we need to take out of the politics. And I would argue we need a Canadian Commission on Macroeconomics and Health. And I would suggest that this should be of all parties, all political stripes, academics, business leaders, not just health leaders, and maybe in time for Women Deliver in 2019, there could be an independent assessment on what's the business case for resources, what's the strategy, what's the blend of resources we need, where do we need public, where do we need innovation, where do we need scale, where do we need private. Internationally, I just came from Washington this morning, people are very concerned about the billions to trillions narrative because it's confusing everyone. And people are just trying to add up types of dollars, but we actually need many types of dollars. Dollars for a pipeline dollars for a health system isn't dollars for schools, isn't dollars for a road. We need many types of resources. And we're going to have an election next year, of course, in 2019 in this country. And I think it would be a great vision of success if in 2019 part of that public conversation was each party, I'm nonpartisan, but if each party were presenting their competing vision for how to succeed on these metrics we all care about. And I would, again, argue we need a Canadian Commission on Macroeconomics and Health to kickstart that with independent experts putting forward a sound vision linked to results.
So just a very, very warm thank you and a big hand of applause.